France's latest flirtation with the far right has come to an end. But this election was close. It's not clear who is in charge, and the French media have come under fire. We take a long look at Vincent Bolloré. France's biggest media owner has his eyes on the African market, all of it. And Gaza. The carnage continues, the killing of innocents, journalists included. This past week, French voters delivered an election upset, coalescing around leftist and centrist parties to block a surging far right from taking power. Call it a reprieve, a fleeting one. French politics are now deeply divided. It is unclear who will govern. This election also revealed much about the French mainstream media, outlets mostly owned by billionaires out to influence. Many news outlets, not just right-wing ones, chose to embrace the National Rally Party led by Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella, trivializing or normalizing some of their racist ideas. On certain channels, they got a disproportionate amount of airtime, and their opponents, the left-wing alliance, got a rough ride, including their controversial leader, Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Despite that, the left-wing bloc is now the largest in Parliament. That in itself is a repudiation of the vision served up by mainstream outlets. And it raises the question, where do they go from here?
We have a plot twist. Tonight, the new Popular Front are the biggest party in the country.
First and foremost, this is a victory against the far-right National Rally Party. It's a reprieve for French citizens, and the question now is no longer about how to barricade against the far right. It's about understanding why the threat of the far right still continues. This is the question we all need to ask ourselves now.
What's in a name? For almost 50 years, France's far-right political party called itself the National Front, a problematic name with ties back to World War II, Vichy France, and collaboration with Nazism. In 2018, the Front changed into the Rassemblement National, the National Rally. 6 years later, in this snap parliamentary election, and with a fresh face out front, Jordan Bardella, the party looked set for a breakthrough, an historic win. The French far-right's rebranding of itself is one thing that has changed. Of greater significance, much of the French mainstream media seemed to reconsider the way they should cover the party, the one with the new name, but the very same past, thereby normalizing the abnormal.
What we observed in the mainstream media in France is the standardization of the far right.
Regardez, il suffit de lire la presse, regardez ce que disent les observateurs. Le RN est peut-être pour la toute première fois de son histoire en mesure de gagner et d'accéder au pouvoir.
And French journalists played a role because we didn't question far-right speakers on their origins. Among the National Front's founders were ex-Nazi collaborators, so it's a party that has a history, and too few journalists mention that.
Est devenue une sorte de droite populiste ou populaire, selon le point de vue que l'on a, et aujourd'hui se fait la défenseur des Juifs.
Historiquement, en France, on avait une tradition.
Historically, in France, we had a tradition of cordon sanitaire. That is to say that we didn't consider the ideas of the extreme right equivalent to the ideas of the right or the left. Then gradually, there was a broadening of the spectrum. A trivialization of the extreme right and a reversal of the stigma. Now it's the left bloc which is stigmatized and the far right is seen as protectors of the nation.
On ferme les frontières, on va remettre de l'ordre.
And there is increasing pressure on journalists to accept and endorse this trivialization of the far right.
Cette banalisation de l'extrême.
It seems no country's media space is complete these days without a right-wing media baron who has an outsized effect on its politics. Meet Vincent Bolloré. Born into an industrial fortune, he grew mega richer through Africa, its shipping and manufacturing markets, before diversifying into the French media market, where he owns scores of news and entertainment outlets. Among them, the Fox in France's henhouse, CNews, a TV channel that leans hard right, and a national radio station, Europe 1.
Les auditeurs et les téléspectateurs et les Français ne sont pas dupes. Ils voient bien qu'ils essaient, tout simplement, de nous fermer notre clapet. On va pas se mentir.
One of Bolloré's primary messengers is Cyril Hanouna, a one-time comedian turned presenter now described as the soft power arm of Bolloré's empire. Politicians, mostly right-wingers, go to Hanouna, who can be crude at times, to reach younger working-class audiences through news wrapped in entertainment.
Par exemple, moi je te le dis, LFI au pouvoir, je pars, c'est sûr.
Oui, c'est ça. On fait l'émission où?
Ah ben on va dans ton cul.
Bolloré's channels have been busted multiple times by France's broadcast regulator Arcom over Hanouna's output. Last year, the TV channel C8 was fined 3.5 million euros for this outburst against a left-wing politician.
Tu fais pas ton métier, tu viens ici, tu fais le malin,
In June, Europe 1 was issued an official warning for its bias on the air. More than half of the people Hanouna interviewed were from the far right. But Vincent Bolloré has got the money. He's paid the fines before, and the content keeps coming.
These shows really focus on a France that they have fantasized as entirely broken.
Oui, il y a une haine de tout ce qui est occidental, de tout ce qui est blanc, de tout ce qui est français, de tout ce qui est judéo-chrétien, de toute cette...
They are a perfect place to radicalize those voters who are feeling vulnerable and essentially give them the image of a country that needs to be rescued by the Rassemblement National, by more law and order, by the rejection of minorities of every kind.
It is obvious that the Bolloré galaxy has placed itself at the service of the national rally. But the question is, why have Bolloré's outlets managed to prosper without anyone standing in their way? Arcom has sanctioned C8 and CNews numerous times over the last few weeks, but this is insufficient. There were grounds for withdrawing their right to broadcast, so it is regretful that Arcom, which is supposed to regulate and ensure pluralism and the honesty of journalism in the media, did not act more severely.
The normalization of the French far right is not limited to Vincent Bolloré's news organizations.
Le principal danger pour les femmes en France, ce sont les hommes. Ce sont les hommes, puisque
ce sont les hommes immigrés africains, noirs et arabes.
Too many news channels and print outlets have focused on far-right talking points: immigration, insecurity, Islam, often coupled with coverage that cast far-left leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon as incapable of governing.
Jean-Luc Mélenchon, l'homme perçu comme le plus mauvais Premier ministre.
Mélenchon is a divisive figure who's been accused of downplaying anti-Semitism in France. He pulls no punches when criticizing Israel's war on Gaza, and his refusal to call Hamas a terrorist group has also landed him in trouble.
He has been branded an outright anti-Semite, and I don't think that that is correct. I don't think that that is true of Jean-Luc Mélenchon. On the other hand, he has gone out of his way to avoid, for example, condemning the specific actions of Hamas on that specific day, 7th of October, in ways that in many respects don't allow him to claim a kind of objective view. I would argue that he's done himself some discredit. I would think that on some issues it would have been more useful to be a little bit more nuanced in order to have a constructive conversation in France.
Certain people thought Mélenchon didn't condemn the Hamas attack sufficiently and that he was too pro-Palestinian. For them, that is enough to make him an anti-Semite and an enemy of peace. Because what the mainstream media are saying is that if Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party defends the Palestinian cause and denounces what many experts consider to be acts of a genocidal nature in Palestine, it is because he wants to please Muslims. Defending humanity does not mean wanting to please Muslims. It is a racist version of things.
So many people in France got it wrong in this election, starting with President Emmanuel Macron, who whose snap election call ended in his party getting trounced. The mainstream media cozying up to the far right, only to see voters favoring the left instead, and pollsters who predicted the national rally would win. What all of them may have underestimated, the impact that alternative news sites now have on the French electorate. Independent outlets and voices, none of them billionaire-backed, who seized the moment and may have won the day.
The new Popular Front taking the lead in this election was a surprise. Everyone was expecting the extreme right to win. It was the exceptional mobilization of civil society and also independent media that changed things. During this election, many independent media, like us at Street Press, conducted investigations on the scandals of far-right candidates. And it's crazy to see how small independents have done the work that larger outlets with hundreds of journalists have not. So today what we need more than ever in France is independent media. Without billionaires leading them, journalists who are free and can investigate the national rally and all its allies.
It has been a horrendous 10 days in Gaza. Ceasefire talks are still ongoing, but Israel has kept up its attacks, especially on Gaza City. The numbers of dead and injured are on the rise, and more Palestinian journalists have been killed. Meenakshi Ravi has been across this story.
This past week, Israel conducted some of the heaviest attacks on Gaza City since the start of the war last October. This latest bombardment was preceded, as it often is, with an airdrop of leaflets instructing Palestinians to evacuate. But as we've also seen before, those who fled along the Israeli military's so-called safe routes were at risk of being killed by Israeli snipers. The orders to leave Gaza City came a day after an Israeli strike on a school in Khan Yunis in southern Gaza, where about 3,000 people were taking shelter. It was Israel's fourth attack on a school in as many days. Displaced and injured Palestinians had gathered at all of those schools. The way some Western outlets covered those strikes was critiqued because of how it compared with the reporting of Russian attacks on Ukrainian sites, such as hospitals. Note the difference in the kind of terminology used here. In the 9 months of the war in Gaza, Western coverage has improved in patches and regressed or stayed the same in some cases. Palestinian journalists continue to deliver updates via social media or through the foreign outlets they work with, and they continue to be targeted for their reporting. This past week, 5 Palestinian journalists were killed in the span of just 24 hours. That takes the number of media workers killed in Gaza since October the 7th to at least 158. This is the deadliest war for reporters in modern history, and it's being waged by what Israelis still call the most moral army in the world.
Thanks, Mina. Back to France and the aforementioned Vincent Bolloré, the billionaire media magnate. Bolloré has a reputation. He's a skilled corporate raider with a well-established strategy. Acquire a small stake at a news organization, slowly build up his shares at said organization, stage a hostile takeover, then lay off a bunch of staff and pivot the outlet editorially to the right, even to the far right. They call it the Bolloré system. And some of his most significant media holdings are outside France, in Africa. His satellite TV company, Canal+, dominates the West and Central African markets. Bolloré is now in the process of taking over a satellite TV company based in Johannesburg, MultiChoice, which has customers across sub-Saharan Africa. Should that deal go through, it would grant a monopoly to one man with the power to determine what kind of content gets broadcast across an entire continent. The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now on what could be the biggest media deal in African history.
French billionaire Vincent Bolloré owns dozens of news outlets and is one of the biggest media moguls in France. He is what you might call a newsman, but speak to some French journalists who used to work for him, like Jean-Baptiste Livoire, and they will tell you that Bolloré is no friend of the media.
He's not someone who likes the news. He's someone who uses the influence of the media for his business. He has a very precise editorial line. After he takes over an outlet, the majority of the editorial staff often go on strike and protest. People end up leaving, and then they hire journalists who are willing to obey.
There is a real purge of journalists and editorial teams whenever he gets his hands on a media outlet. Each time he takes control, the media company completely changes its editorial line and tilts towards the extreme right.
The easiest example is a French news outlet called CN News. It's now the second biggest current affairs TV channel in France. And under his ownership, it has changed to be the French version of Fox News.
Le maire, le professeur, le policier, tous ces gens-là sont beaucoup moins écoutés que le trafiquant de drogue ou que l'imam.
We're going to have talking heads talking about how immigrants are going to replace the native French population, urging Muslims to renounce their faith in order to assimilate into French society. That's that sort of thing.
That's the modus operandi Bolloré used to transform France's media, but more and more his attention has turned to Africa. His media group is called Vivendi. Amongst its holdings is Canal+. When Bolloré took over in 2012, he rapidly grew Canal+ into the largest satellite television provider in Francophone Africa. Bolloré made most of his money in Africa through his transport and logistics company, and it soon became clear that he did not want his news outlets, or the ones that he carried, holding power to account. Rather, by censoring unfavorable stories or dropping critical channels, he showed how his media holdings could be used to secure his wider business interests.
In 2017, we did a report on Canal+ on a popular revolt against the dictator of Togo, Gnassingbé Eyadema. But it just so happened that Bolloré was trying and hoping to sign contracts with Togo, and so he had this report removed from the channel so as not to disturb his friend Eyadema.
Le Togo peut aussi s'appuyer sur sa stabilité. Stabilité de l'économie, mais aussi une stabilité politique qui sécurise tout le pays et encourage des investissements venus du monde entier.
And as if that wasn't enough, 2 months later they had the management of Canal+ produce an advertorial for Togo's dictator to please him, which they then broadcast in secret at 7 a.m. on Canal+ channels.
Last December, Canal+ pulled 3 channels off of its offering in West Africa at the request of the military government of Mamadi Doumbouya in Guinea. And those channels were critical of the military government. So that is bigger than editorial control, right? You can just blacklist a channel and keep it out of the platform.
After pleading guilty to corruption charges in France related to electoral interference in both Togo and Guinea, Bolloré sold his transport business in 2022 for more than $6 billion and announced his retirement, although insiders say that was just symbolic. Bolloré is now trying to buy Africa's largest satellite TV operator, MultiChoice, which operates across 50 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And the way he's going about it fits the pattern of what is known as the Bolloré system, where he gradually buys shares in a company until he is in a position to stage a hostile takeover. And this is what it looks like when you combine the reach Bolloré already has with Canal+, with what he could have with MultiChoice.
So for many people, this is a red flag because we do not know what the game plan at the end could look like. It could significantly alter what kind of content people get access to. It could change how advertising works on the continent. It could increase the prices for pay TV across the continent and make television even way more inaccessible to millions of households on the continent. But what we know for a fact is he's trying to grow Canal+, he's trying to make it a Pan-African brand, and in doing so, he has deployed the strategy that we have all known him to deploy for a long time.
The concern with this merger is that not only could Bolloré pick and choose the news channels that are carried by MultiChoice's satellite service, giving him a near monopoly on the kind of journalism that's broadcast across the continent. There's also the matter of advertising revenue generated by MultiChoice, which Bolloré could channel to France and away from African news organizations and production houses that rely on those funds to survive. And if you look at the Bolloré system, that business model already exists.
En effet, le rapprochement de Vincent Bolloré avec MultiChoice.
The connection between Vincent Bolloré and MultiChoice can quickly produce some serious problems. Most international advertisers with big budgets spend the majority of their advertising on Canal+ here in France. So this money, which should be used to nourish the African TV landscape, instead goes to French channels broadcasting on Bolloré's group. The revenue that should have been created around the popularity of television in sub-Saharan Africa is instead siphoned off to France. It's likely that the same thing will happen in South Africa.
Ça risque de se passer en fait en Afrique du Sud.
So already, African journalism is too easy to influence by the political elite because it is cash-strapped, and that would increase that threat. Not being economically viable is a real threat to journalism, because if you shrink the independent sources of livelihood for journalists and media owners, you open them up for influence, bribery from the political elite.
We put in interview requests at Vivendi and MultiChoice, but neither responded. Executives at both companies say that this is a commercial venture that will help them compete with entertainment streaming giants like Netflix and Disney+. They dismissed claims over press freedom, saying that MultiChoice doesn't produce news content, it just carries it. But the ability to curate news and entertainment programming will only exacerbate concerns over Bolloré's growing monopoly in Africa.
Influence doesn't have to happen through news. In fact, the method is usually to replace news with entertainment type of programming. And in Africa, some of these extremist views aren't even necessarily being done through news media primarily.
Tell me, are you not one of those fake pastors? I'm sorry I'm a straightforward person.
I actually appreciate your question very, very much. If you sit down with a fake pastor right now, you never admit that I'm a fake pastor.
They're being done through pastors, through entertainment figures and people like that. So that is dangerous, even in really mature media markets. It's even more dangerous where people are information poor, where the presence of good, well-resourced journalism to counter such narratives is little.
When you look at it in this sense, people are basically letting this very important media business just let it go, let it be acquired by this major billionaire who has had a very checkered history, even within Africa, and people are asking questions about not just why, but what's going to happen next.
And finally, many American Democrats were hoping that Joe Biden's news conference on Thursday would be his last as their presidential candidate for November. 85% of U.S. voters now consider Biden too old for the job and want him replaced by someone younger to take on Donald Trump. At Thursday's NATO meeting, Biden introduced Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as President Putin, Zelensky's mortal enemy.
Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. You can beat President Putin. President Zelensky.
Then, during his subsequent press conference, he used the term Vice President Trump to describe his own Vice President, Kamala Harris. Every time Biden was asked about his ability to do the job for the next 4 years, he talked about his record over the past 3, which is not what Americans are concerned with. Despite all of that, Biden's backers maintained that he did well that night. Has there ever been a lower bar in American politics? And there's a reason why this story hits home for so many people. We all know what aging looks like. It is the rarest kind of political story in that it's not about complicated policies or geostrategies. Everybody gets it because we've all seen it. And that, ultimately, is Joe Biden's problem. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.